You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm joined by Molly Wilkinson, an American expat who's living the dream teaching folks how to perfect the art of French desserts. It's no surprise, then, that she's here to chat with me about everything from cooking school to bakeries to the patron saint of pastry on this episode, delving into the word pâtisserie. I am so excited to be welcoming Molly Wilkinson onto the podcast today. Molly, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Molly, you're kind of living the dream. I mean, people tell me I'm living the dream, but I think you're really living the dream here in Paris. Can you share to our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do? I'm sorry, you're not in Paris, in the Paris area, the greater Paris. So what are you doing here in France?
So I'm originally from Dallas, Texas, and I live in Versailles, hence the sort of near Paris.
Yeah.
I'm actually 5 minutes walk from the palace in an 18th century apartment with original parquet floors. And what I do for a living is I teach pastry. So I teach people how to make French pastries online and then also private classes in our home. So it really is a fantastic, fun, creative, sweet job, I would say.
Wow. That is the toughest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. I feel so sorry for you.
I do eat a lot of sweets, yes.
Yeah. How did you get into that? How did you end up coming from Texas to France and mastering French pastry to such an extent that you can actually convey that knowledge to others?
So it was a bit of a journey, I will say. And it wasn't something that I dreamed of as a little girl. But I did love baking when I was very young. That was always this really big passion of mine. And my mom really fostered it in the kitchen. So that was, our constant activity during the summer breaks from school. I was making brownies and cookies, and I just loved it. I absolutely loved it. I really enjoyed making simple things that tasted good. I liked the whole process. But in terms of going into it as a job, I never thought that it was possible. And the reason why is because I think at that time of life, just growing up as a young girl, the message was really like, go out, be successful, be a doctor, be a lawyer, an astronaut. And this wasn't that job that was deemed as successful. And so I just never heard it as something that, I should go into per se. And so I just continued baking and, having a good time and learning more and more in the kitchen, but without any sort of goal in mind. And just kept getting better at it. Went to college, studied abroad in France. Just for 2 weeks, ended up leaving France and being like, I've got to go back at some point. Graduated with an advertising PR degree. And I started working, so as an intern at my last year in college. And I think that was a little bit of a turning point, honestly. And the reason why is because I went in for my interview with the HR person, and I just remember her asking me what I really enjoyed doing. What were my hobbies? What was my passion? And I started talking about baking, and we talked about it for probably about 30 minutes, which in an interview is really unheard of when you're supposed to, be talking about how you're a hard worker and motivated. I was talking about cookies and how I really enjoyed baking for people. And she could just hear the passion in my voice. Because it's true, like I'd been baking practically every week, making cakes for friends, things like that. And she asked me, she said, have you ever considered going to culinary school? And I briefly thought about it, but again, that 9-to-5 job, managing people was what was deemed a success story for my generation. And so I hadn't really, I kind of just a little bit here and there thought about it, but didn't think that it was, something that I could really do. But her asking me, maybe as more of a larger figure, just as an HR person coming to me and saying that, maybe legitimized it a little bit in my mind. And I worked for them for several years, worked my way up the ladder, constantly was bringing in sweets into the office. And finally, I reached this point where it was this fork in the road where I could either pursue managerial positions in the company. And I liked it. I liked being in Excel. I thought it was fun. I didn't mind it. I loved like the office atmosphere. I was having a good time. I was managing a team of 6. Or I could put that on pause, which at that moment, it was just that time where if I stepped away for a couple of months and I tried out something new, I could come back. And so I had a solid plan B, just like a backup plan just in case. And so I started looking for schools. Before that, I did community college, just in the culinary field, doing basic cuisine for 3 months in the evenings. Loved it. So I loved being in a uniform, scrubbing the floors after class. I just loved the camaraderie of the kitchen, working with my hands, the creativity. And at that point, I was 25, 26. And so, I started looking for schools. I looked in the US, and a lot of the schools had lots of additional classes with them, like calculus and stuff. And I'd already done that.
Yeah.
They were like really long too. And I was like, no, thank you. So in my mind, France came back as this place that I'd visited and loved. And I was like, well, France, that's where pastry and baking, professionally, it was really born. And so I started looking at the Cordon Bleu and a couple of other schools, and the Cordon Bleu just fit for me. And so went there and just kind of started going from there. Like I got my pastry certification after being there for a year, started doing internships, working at different bakeries, but all the while working remotely still for this marketing company because I'm very
okay. Yeah.
So I was doing a lot. I was like doing a very physical job, standing in the kitchen for hours and hours at a time. And then also one where I was like sitting and staring at Excel and numbers. And so it just kind of went from there. I decided that I really wanted to pursue pastry, and I absolutely loved it. I'd never baked French pastries before, and there was something about the combination of flavors, the actual set of skills that was required for doing these recipes, how they'd been around for hundreds of years. And it was a very artisanal task here in France as well. And so I don't know, I fell into this career where this was what I was meant to do. It felt. And I ended up quitting that marketing job, and it was up and down for several years trying to figure out what specifically I wanted to do in pastry while gaining experience. And it really came down to teaching. That was what I really enjoyed, was coming to people and being like, look, I used to bake cookies and brownies, and I am now baking, cream puffs and macaron. And I really want to show you how to do that with an American mindset behind it. Also explaining how it's done in terms and phrases that are a little bit more understandable for someone who came from that background where treats are a little bit more simple to going to something that's a little bit more complex. And it's just been a blast, and I love it.
Amazing. And I think with your sort of external viewpoint and having been someone who obviously grew up in the States and came into the world of French pastry arts as a foreigner, I think that you're particularly well-versed to help us sort of navigate some of the differences between, you brushed up against some of them, this fact that like a lot of American baked goods are a little simpler. You know, we grow up making them at home with our moms or our grandmas or our dads or whoever. In France, I think, you know, there's a whole other world of this, and not just the actual cakes themselves, but the whole culture around them is so different. And that's something that I'm really excited to chat with you about. But first off, this word pâtisserie that we have in French has two distinct meanings, right? It means like the pastry arts, but it also means the shop. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I notice a lot of Americans getting a little confused about when they come to Paris is that there's a difference between, you know, when we say a bakery or a pastry shop, there are places that sell different categories of things. So we have a pâtisserie, we have a boulangerie, but some boulangerie also sell pâtisserie. Mm-hmm. How would you sort of describe the differences between those two shops, and when are those differences important?
Oh, yes. I love this question because it's something really, really interesting too, because pastry, cooking, baking, they are very different in France. So it is, like I was saying, very artisanal. And within that field, you have lots of different areas, so to say. So you have pastry, but then you also have ice cream, chocolate, and candy. Those are all very separate and not contained within pastry. And then you also have boulangerie. So that would be your breads, but also viennoiserie, which is your yeasted, more sweet doughs, things like that. So they are all very, very different. So for example, in pastry, I don't work with yeast really at all. Sometimes with brioche, but that's about it. So croissant is something that I briefly learned at the Cordon Bleu because it's something that everyone really wants to learn, and I was very excited about it. But when you're working as a pastry chef in a kitchen, you don't do croissant. That is more so under the field of boulangerie, viennoiserie. So exactly as you're saying, Emily, when you go to look for certain stores in Paris, in France, you'll have your pâtisserie, which is going to serve your sweet treats. Usually they're very complex. How I like to describe them is it's kind of you open it up and there's almost like a surprise because there's so many multi-layers of flavors and textures that are happening. Whereas if you go to a boulangerie, their focus is more on breads and baguettes and brioche and things like that. Now, when you have both in a shop, usually they excel at more at one or the other. And typically, when it is a boulangerie pâtisserie, because it is the two, typically they're better with boulangerie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so when you are in Paris, for example, you walk in any street corner, you're going to have a boulangerie that also sells some pastries. But if you want something super special, like you said, you go to a pâtisserie where they're not going to sell any bread, and they're probably not going to sell any croissants with a few exceptions. They're going to just sell my gosh.
Exactly.
I'm diminishing it, but they're going to sell exclusively these sort of jewels of little cakes, and there's no bread, there's no real savory at all.
Exactly. And I think the reason why is that when people go to a boulangerie, they want access to an eclair. They want access to a religieuse to have with lunch, or a flan, or, a fruit tart, things like that. Or it's also that one-stop mentality too, which is totally, you go in and what you're expecting from a boulangerie pâtisserie is things that are a little bit more casual for the French, but still very good quality. Not in all instances, but if you want something super, super fancy, then you're going to, a pâtisserie, and it's maybe more for a special occasion, like a birthday, things like that.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, where each week host Jennifer interviews a different author about his or her book set in Paris or France. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. So, the special occasion thing leads me to a major cultural difference between the French and the Americans that I learned through a faux pas, which is one of the best ways to learn about cultural differences, even though it's so embarrassing.
Agreed.
So when I was 16 years old, I was studying abroad here, and I was here with a group of Americans, and one of my friends had a birthday. And this was in a time before easy access to the internet. So I called my mom long distance and was like, will you get down the Joy of Baking cookbook and read me a recipe for white sheet cake so I can make sheet cake for...
Oh, yes.
So I'm making a sheet cake with a cup measure that I'm then trying to convert into grams. Yep. I've mistranslated powdered sugar to sucre en poudre, which is granulated sugar. So I have a grainy icing, an unrisen cake, made a true labor of love. And I bring it to this party, which is co-attended by French people and American people. And I've got my lopsided, I love you so much cake. And his French friends have gone to the pastry shop and gotten this like chocolate sculpture with like, you know, sugar art and ganache. And they looked at me and they were like, but why would you do such a thing?
Well, it's totally just a cultural difference, and there's nothing wrong with either one. But it really is in France, birthdays and anniversaries, things like that, they're taken as well. And also, I will add that a lot of French kitchens are very, very small. And so to even attempt a really, really special cake is exactly as you found out. It is a labor of love, and it takes, a lot of skill, and usually there's no space. Often people don't have mixers in France because at home, the type of cakes that they're making are very, very simple. They're super, super simple. You have your yogurt cake. You have essentially a pound cake. You'll do tarts, but often people will buy the dough from the grocery store, things like that. And so that's what people are making at home here in France.
Yeah.
And, or a gâteau au chocolat, but they're going to the pastry shop, and it really is like this fun occasion, this really great excuse to get something just really extravagant and over the top and celebrate. And it's amazing that is what is done here, and something that you can purchase just like that, off the streets.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the difference between something like that and this, staple that you just evoked, the yogurt cake, is yogurt cake, for anyone who's not done this recipe, is the simplest thing. It's like the French, when you're a little American kid and you're learning to make your first batch of like chocolate chip cookies, the French kids are learning to make yogurt cake, which is literally you take a container of plain yogurt and that becomes your measuring cup. And it's like a one bowl cake situation. It's delicious.
Yeah.
But it's so, so easy.
Oh, yeah.
As compared to some of these marvels of pastry architecture that you find in the shops.
Yeah. And that's the neat thing too. Like I've said a couple of times, pastry is really seen as this artisanal craft. And it's really supported in France too, which I love.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. So let's dig into that, because I think in some of my other research and in speaking with experts in the French sort of approach to food, the French really do see their day as being divided by their meals. And their meals are still, even now, meals with courses. Even during the week, you'll have like an appetizer, main, cheese, dessert. And a lot of French families have dessert every night and sometimes even at lunchtime. But I think that dessert doesn't always look the way that we think of dessert looking. Like I know a lot of people who just have a yogurt with like a spoonful of homemade jam in it for dessert, or like a piece of fruit. So when are the French actually eating all of these very elaborate pastries? Is it every day? Is it once a week? When do you see people actually eating pastry?
So exactly what you're saying. There's usually, your times where this happens. And I would say the most likely is going to be a Sunday lunch when you're en famille and, you're visiting your grandmère, your grandmother. And so what you do is maybe you bring a bottle of wine. She's made a whole beautiful meal with multiple courses. And maybe you come with a dessert as well. But in terms of your little desserts, I don't know about you, but Francois and we do buy them just occasionally for fun.
Yeah.
But then again, it's totally research for me. So
same here. Hard job.
Oh yeah, exactly. But you also have what's called goûter, And so that is at 4 o'clock. It's when the kids are coming home from school, and you'll pass by the bakery, the boulangerie, the pâtisserie, and you'll pick up a little something sweet. So it could be an eclair, it could be a cream puff, a religieuse, flan, could be as simple as a chouquette, which is so delicious. I love those.
For those of our listeners who don't know what a chouquette is, can you clue us in?
Yes. So it's essentially taking the same dough that you use for a cream puff, but it's taking it back to the basics. So there's no filling on the inside. Sometimes there is, though. Sometimes you'll see whipped cream or pastry cream at certain places, but typically it's not. And the thing is that dough is so buttery and eggy and soft on the inside that you're really celebrating that. And you add this touch of sweetness on the outside with pearl sugar. So it's kind of like eating sugar clouds. You bite in and it's soft, but also there's this crunch of sugar, and they are addictive. Like, you buy them by weight. So you'll get like a bag of like 100 grams of chouquettes, or you'll be like, no, I want 200. You just pop them in like popcorn. So good. But yeah, in terms of when people eat pastries, it would be those sorts of scenarios. So, just for fun in the week, sometimes goûter, so which is really that 4 o'clock snack time for kids, or I would say on the weekends when you're doing something with your family.
Yeah, I love chouquettes are definitely a guilty pleasure of mine, and they're one of my sister's favorite things. And I remember one year I was going back to the States to visit, and I wanted to get some chouquette to bring back to her, but obviously they're not something that keep particularly well, so I wanted to get them as fresh as possible. And the man at my local bakery said that he was out of them, but he could bake me more as long as I bought something preposterous like 300 grams of them. So I flew back to New York with a bag of warm chouquettes on my knees. And by the time I got there, like, everybody on the airplane hated me, and, but my sister got her pastry. So.
Oh, wow. How awesome is that? That was so nice of your bakery too.
Yeah, I was very lucky. So the pastries that you were talking about are mostly members of this sort of category of pastries made with choux dough or choux pastry. But when you walk into a pâtisserie, a pastry shop, you're going to see a lot of different sort of categories and items. And I think that, one of my favorite places to go in Paris is Karl Marletti, which is in the 5th arrondissement. And he just has this window of, like, I think 15 or 20 different choices of pastry, which is exciting for people, but also can be a little bit sort of unnerving, where you're like, how do I even know where to begin? Do you have a way of kind of navigating or like subdividing your pastry shop into different categories, or how you know where to begin?
Yeah, I would just start by what you enjoy eating the most. So think about it as categories, so to say, like you're saying. So something with fruit, something with chocolate, something creamy, something light, and you'll be able to really narrow down what's in that pastry shop window very easily visually, actually. And then from there, I would look at the tags and I would say, okay, this one has chocolate and raspberry. Maybe that's what I'm looking for in my flavor combination. And I wouldn't get overwhelmed by how they look per se, but I would focus on the flavors instead.
Okay. And speaking of those flavors, are there any sort of flavor combinations or flavors that you think are more common in France than elsewhere, particularly in the US?
So I would say, you do have your classic tarte au citron, so your lemon tart. There's always going to be something with fruit. If it's a good pastry shop, it should always be seasonal for sure, because that's when you're going to get the best flavor. So you really only want to see strawberries in, May, June, maybe going into July, depending on the variety. That's something that I'd never experienced before in the US, was the different varieties of strawberries and how they come out, different times in the summer. And I love it. I absolutely love that. And how you only see rhubarb for really just like 3 weeks, something, it's just really fun. Oh my gosh, I forgot the question now.
So I'll admit, when I came up with this question, I was thinking of something in particular. So there are flavors here, like, for example, we just come out of the Christmas season, chestnuts. For example, you don't see a ton of chestnut flavored pastry in the US. And as a counterpart in the US, you get like a lot of like peanut butter flavored things that you don't really find here. And I was just wondering if in your time here, you've encountered any other sort of flavors that are really common or beloved in France that you really don't see in the US, or any other American flavors that you really won't see that often in traditional French pastry, at least.
Yeah, I think you really nailed it when you said chestnut, because that was something that I had never really experienced in the US either. I would also say tonka.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, such a special flavor. It's very interesting. It's actually illegal in the US. Because if you eat it in large quantity, like we're talking like large quantities, then it can be poisonous. But here it's used almost like vanilla. And it's more complex than vanilla, which is very, very interesting. And along that note, actually, vanilla is typically only used in pastries where they really want that vanilla note to sing. Whereas in American desserts, it's mostly in everything. We just love vanilla. We love cinnamon, we love vanilla. And so we put it in everything. Whereas in France, a lot of my students are very surprised when, there isn't vanilla in a cake, or sometimes there isn't even salt, which is very interesting too. And it's more of a cultural thing. And it is about making sure that the flavor profiles that you want to stand out in that dessert, those are the ones that are being celebrated, and we're not adding anything else in. It's a very purist form, I would say, which kind of makes sense with, France as how traditional a country it can be. And so, yeah, tonka, love that. Yeah.
Yeah, tonka for sure. And that what you said about vanilla is,
yes,
you're totally right. I remember growing up getting eclairs in New York City where the icing was chocolate, but the inside was vanilla cream. And you never see that here.
No.
That seems to sort of be, to your point, about being real purists about it, kind of.
Yeah, well, and I think too, visually, if you're in a pastry shop, you want to be able to look at the eclairs. And this is what the pastry chef is thinking too. And they want those flavors to match, so to say. So if it's an eclair and it's chocolate icing, then it's going to be chocolate on the inside. Maybe they mix it a little bit. Like you have l'Eclair de Genie. You have a couple of other eclair shops that have really interesting combinations of flavors on the inside, but the top will reflect that as well in terms of how they've decorated it. So, yeah.
Definitely. And you also mentioned cinnamon, which in America we use everywhere. And I feel like you can't have an apple without cinnamon. But in France, it's not that common.
No, it's actually a flavor that they don't really like that much.
Yeah.
And so I think you're starting to see it a little bit more just because of westernization just in general. But I remember one of my pastry chefs at the Cordon Bleu being like, I just remember arriving in New York, I'd flown over, exiting the airplane, and just this waft of cinnamon, which as Americans, we all know was Cinnabon.
Yeah, of course. Or Auntie Anne's pretzels.
Exactly. And he was just like, whoosh, it was just this massive, massive smell of cinnamon. And it's just really funny. But I think you are starting to see it a little bit more, which is quite fun. Cookies are a big thing in France, right?
Yep.
A very big thing. I think it's a little bit less so now, but the last 2 years, these very elaborate cookings with different dollops of, icings and different pastes and ganaches on top were extraordinarily popular. And that just cracks me up, because to me, that's more of a dessert instead of a cookie at that point. Because
right. Oh, totally. It's like if you need a spoon to eat your cookie, it's not a cookie anymore.
Exactly.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, The Heart of You, where expert Annette talks manifesting, tarot, and so much more. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. It is interesting to see how, I think that that a lot of non-French people would assume that French people are prideful in their culinary arts, which they then sort of leads people to this conclusion that the French wouldn't possibly want to eat a donut or a cookie. But if you go to a lot of French bakeries these days, you're going to see donuts and cookies and even like babka and what is it? Bostock. It's like that English sort of.
Oh, yeah.
So there is a welcoming of desserts and baked goods from elsewhere these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is like it's a touch of westernization for sure. Like when you walk in and you're getting your baguette sandwich, like you're going to see cookies. Like you'll see like your classic like chocolate chip cookies, but the chocolate chips here are mini. So, that you can buy in the store, or, you just get a bar of chocolate and you cut it up. And they're certainly not exactly what you're expecting sometimes. Like I like a good chewy chocolate chip cookie. And I'm actually lucky there's a bakery just down the street from us. It's called Pierre et Tim. And it's two French guys and they just love cookies. And so they've opened up a cookie only shop and they are so good. Chewy, just what you would expect. Like it's just, oh man, it just speaks to me.
Okay, so I love cookies too. However, I also love these really, really classic French pastries. And with so many to choose from, I'm going to ask you a very difficult question, which is, let's say that you are on a desert island and you can only have 3 classic French pastries. Which ones would you pick?
Oh my gosh, that is tough. Okay, well, one of my favorites is a Saint-Honoré. And I love it because it's actually named after the patron saint of bakers, which is just fun in general. It even has
as you do.
Oh, yes, as you do. It has a specific piping tip as well that you use for the decoration, which was invented for this. And for me, I love the combination of textures and flavors. It is just like classic upon classic French pastry. So you have a base of puff pastry. On top of that, you have a ring of cream puffs going around the edge. Those cream puffs are filled with vanilla pastry cream, and then they're dipped in caramel and also stuck to the puff pastry with caramel. So you have like crunchy caramel all around. And then in the center of the cake, you also have a little bit of that same dough, the pâte à choux dough that has been baked on top of the puff pastry to add a different, textural component. A little bit more pastry cream and then chantilly cream. So it's just this flaky, buttery, caramel. It's so good. And I just start off by eating the cream puffs around the edge and it's just fantastic. So I would say that for sure. And then, you got to have something refreshing, right? So if I went for like very traditional, I'd probably say like a tarte au citron. And for a lot of people in France, there's a very big discussion on if you have it with meringue on top or not. And people have their preferences. And so a lot of pastry shops, they actually sell both versions so that you can pick. And I would pick it with meringue because, if I was on a desert island, then for sure,
You got to have the meringue in that case.
Exactly. And then I would say the last one, I would go back to something that for me, it's almost like the chocolate chip cookie of French baking. And it's something that I discovered when I was living in Paris off of Rue Montorgueil, which has the oldest pastry shop in Paris, Stoyer. And I walked in and by the checkout, oh shoot, I'm going to add 2. Okay. I'm just like curious.
I'll allow it.
Okay. By the cash register. I just like snuck it in. Like I didn't realize I was going to be on a desert island. So I just happened to to appear for me.
It fell into your bag.
Exactly. And so, by the cash register, there's always like something little that you're like, And they had 2 things that I just consistently would get. The first one was a mini beignet filled with Nutella. So good. And so, kind of like eating a donut whole with like chocolate on the inside. And then along that note, there's something called a tigre, which means tiger in French. And this is one of my all-time favorites too. And it's just something that it's actually, oh man, I have like so many I could tell you about.
Well, that's why That's why people should sign up for classes with you, because
Yes!
they can learn all about all of the favorites and learn to even make them.
Exactly. It's so much fun. And like this recipe for the tigre, it's in my cookbook as well.
Oh, amazing.
And it's like, the thing is they stopped making it. And I had been sending people over there to get this specific dessert because it's pretty traditional, I would say. And you don't see it always. See it relatively often, but it is a almond butter cake. So it's very, very, very rich. And then with that cake, they have folded in lots of small pieces of chocolate. And they do that when the batter is cold so the chocolate doesn't melt in it. And so it looks a little bit like spots. And so that's why they call it a tigre. They should call it a leopard, but that's okay. And then in the middle, there's actually an indentation, and that indentation is filled with a very, very rich chocolate ganache, sometimes caramel, but typically a chocolate ganache. And it is just very rich, very buttery. It is small too. It's the size of I'd say a little bit smaller than the size of your palm, essentially, and flat. And it's so good. I love it. And I figured out how to replicate it at home just using a muffin tin, because that's one of my big points too when I'm teaching is there's a lot of special equipment that can go into pastry to make all of these different shapes and stuff, but you can make the same at home using stuff that you probably already have. So those would be the 4.
Okay, the 4. The 3 and a freebie.
Yes, 3 and a freebie.
Now, coming back to what you were saying about your sort of personal journey towards pastry and the fact that at the beginning, you even had this internalized wariness of making it your career. I think in France for a long time, becoming a pastry chef wasn't necessarily perceived as, the summum of all things success oriented. But these days, first of all, it doesn't matter if success is, following your bliss. But also, I think that there's been a refocusing on, these artisan crafts, like you've been saying. And some pastry chefs, I'm thinking, for example, of Cédric Grolet, have become almost rock stars in the minds of the French. Have you sort of perceived an evolution in terms of how French society perceives the people who are making pastries in France, in the time since you first came here?
Oh, so I first came here in 2013, so it's almost been 10 years, which is crazy. In that time, I actually noticed more of a change with what people were wearing. Yeah, when I first arrived, I would feel very, very self-conscious if I didn't go out the door wearing my Sunday best. And now, tennis shoes are okay, things like that. In terms of pastry and how it's perceived, I would say that you're right that there are, and I think this is because of social media, really, that in the last probably 5 to 6 years, there are these figures, exactly like you're saying, like Cédric Grolet or François Perret at the Ritz, who are perceived as these mega stars, these gods in pastry that people look up to worldwide for their craft, for the finesse that they put into pastries in particular. But I feel like, honestly, that has always been somewhat the case for the French because culturally food is so important for them. So, previously, like in the US, we had Martha Stewart, we still have Martha Stewart. And it was because she was on TV, from the cookbooks, the magazines, things like that. And here you have similar people too, like Christophe Fedler. He's been around for a long time in France and, is very, very well known. And so it is, for me, it's very much so social media. And in terms of the difference between the US and France and, looking at this as a field, I feel like it's more celebrated in France as something that you're putting a lot of art into. Like, it's very artistic. It's very, there's a lot of passion that goes into it too. And it's a lot of hard work. And I think it is celebrated in general. Whereas in the US, sometimes it's seen as just a low-end job, which is really unfortunate. And in France, though, you also see that with other types of positions too, where, it could be the local cobbler, you're going in, you're having your shoes fixed, and people respect that. Like, it's very respected in terms of a position, which I really, really appreciate, which I like. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think that's happening even more in France now, like what you said with this sort of social mediaization of it, because I know that when I was in French school, there was like at 16, you take this big exam and people are either on the university track or they're not. And if you're not, you can become a pastry chef. So at 16, you might make the decision to go into pastry. And I think that for a while, there was this weird positioning of it as like, oh, well, you're not academic, so go be a pastry chef. But now all this artisan, craft, it really does seem as though it's being celebrated. And you see people reconverting, which is, doing exactly what you did, leaving, a career where it would have been framed in like a Western mind as being, oh, success is sitting at a desk, and now success is doing what you love, which is really exciting, I think.
It is. I think it is really exciting. And I think it's almost a change worldwide too, in terms of how people are feeling
totally
about work in general, which is nice. I like it.
Absolutely. I like it too. Well, obviously you have a ton of passion for this and a ton of knowledge. So anybody who is excited by the idea of making French pastry at home, and frankly, who isn't excited by that, should make sure and check out Molly's classes. We will drop a link in the show notes so that you can go and see for yourself. Molly, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It has been so fun chatting with you. Before I let you go, I just have one last question for you, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So my favorite word for the longest time has been parapluie.
I love that one.
I think it's really
Which means umbrella.
Yes. Parapluie.
It just sounds nice.
It does. It sounds very elegant. I like it.
Perfect. Well, I hope that you do not need your parapluie today.
I hope not.
I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you, everyone, so much for tuning in and listening. Thanks, Molly. Have a really fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.